The other thing that you're going to establish in Act 1 are your characters. When you establish your characters, you're doing the same thing where you're also giving time and space. So you want to remember that you're going to establish the voice of the characters. A character in Atlanta, Georgia will not speak the same way that a character in London, Britain will speak. The character in Atlanta, Georgia is not also in 1865 is going to speak differently than a character in Atlanta, Georgia in 1965 or in 2065. All of those things have to come through with voice. And voice, what we mean by voice is the way that your character speaks. Their accent, their speech pattern, the rhythm, the way they pronounce words, the different words they use, slang words that they may use. All of that is a part of the person's voice. Also, what's a part of the person's voice is whether they're sarcastic or whether they're passive-aggressive or whether they have a fairly cheerful tone of voice. This is all part of voice. So your voice carries a lot. Also, when you establish your characters, you're going to also establish their nature, which we can start to see how voice then gives that indication of nature. You are not going to set the nature of your character by saying she is sad, she is melancholy, because that's not concrete language. That's nothing we can visualize. The same thing with setting, where it doesn't work for us to say 1865, those are numbers, those are not visuals. Visually, we establish that setting with the cotton field, with the Neo-Greco plantation house in the background. That's how we establish 1865. The same thing with your character. How do we establish a sad character? We have them slumped. We have them, standing in a stance. We have them crying. We have these very visual cues to establish their nature. So if they are a cheerful person, we have them upbeat. We have them bouncing. We have them moving. We have them with a smile on their face. It's going to be a visual expression. Again, right back to concrete language. What does this person look like? What does this person sound like? What does this person smell like? What does this person taste like? What does this person touch? When we touch them, what do they feel like? So we're not talking about internal feelings. We're not saying, sad I can't touch, but rough skin I can touch. I know what that feels like. A sweaty face, I know what that feels like. So that touch is what we're really thinking of, and not feel. So that's also how you're going to establish character. Now you have a really primary character, as we all know, our main character, our protagonist, that we must establish in Act 1. And in establishing our protagonist, it is very important that we establish the same things we're establishing with the other characters, the voice and the nature of the other characters. We also need to do that for our protagonist, but our protagonist has an additional task that we must do, which is give the protagonist objective. Throughout the entire film, the protagonist will have an overriding goal. The goal that they want that by the end of the film they're going to have completed. That is their objective. We want to establish our protagonist's objective. If we have a passive protagonist, so a protagonist that doesn't necessarily have a specific objective, then we're going to establish that protagonist's desire. And what we mean by desire is this is something that if the protagonist doesn't have a specific objective, they still have a yearning, they still have a want for something. They may not have the objective of wanting to get married, but instead they have the desire of not wanting to be alone. So you want to have one or the other. Picking one or the other is pretty much a decision really early on whether you have a passive protagonist or an active protagonist. This is something that is going to kind of come more naturally or organic to you. You will imagine your character. Your character is simply something that's come to your mind. You're imagining who this person is. And you may not necessarily imagine, hey, they're going to be an active protagonist, or hey, I'm going to set out to purposely imagine a passive protagonist. Instead, you've imagined your protagonist, and she is a girl who wants to win Miss America. When you sit back and look at your imagination, you go, well, that's a pretty specific objective. So I'm dealing with an active protagonist. You may imagine a female who simply has a desire to be seen as beautiful, has a desire to be seen as something that people seek after, people are nice to. There's all these things that she begins to associate. Beautiful people have an easier time in life. So she just has a desire to be beautiful. When you look back at your imagination and go, oh, there's this person I imagined. Well, who is this person I imagined? When you look and see, well, she has a desire. She doesn't really have something specific that she's after. So I've imagined a passive character. That's more how it works. You're not going to necessarily make the decision from the get-go, she's got a specific objective or she's got an overriding desire. Instead, you're going to have the imagination, and then you're going to analyze your imagination and go, oh, I'm dealing with a specific objective. If you've imagined a character, you're just like, this is a character, she was born in Atlanta, and she's a wonderful girl, and she likes playing with ponies, and her mother always thinks it's funny how her daughter will make up these great little stories. So that's my protagonist. When you look back at your imagination, you realize your imagination didn't give you everything you need yet. Your imagination didn't give you an objective for that character, and it didn't give you a desire for that character. So you're looking at a protagonist that there's still more your imagination has to give you. So let yourself imagine some more. Ask yourself some questions. Well, does this girl that I like so much, who comes up with these fanciful stories and was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and likes to ride ponies, or whatever it was that I said a few moments ago about that, what does she want? Ask yourself, what does she want? And you're either going to answer that question is either going to be something very specific. Well, she wants her parents not to be divorced. Great. Objective. Well, she wants to grow up in a family that looks like the family she sees on TV. Desire. Now, you ask yourself, you know what questions to ask of your imagination based on what we're learning in this story arc. So this is what you want to establish with your character, with your protagonist. Your protagonist needs an objective and a desire. Your protagonist also needs a flaw. And you may have many flaws that you give your protagonist. You're also going to give your protagonist, in the same hand of giving your protagonist flaws, is you're giving your protagonist strengths. We need to see both in our protagonist. To invest in our protagonist, we need to see what of value, what is this person strong at. But we also need to see where is this person vulnerable. What are this person's flaws? In a tragedy, it's going to be a tragic flaw. A tragic flaw is going to be something that plays throughout the rest of the story because it's going to be that tragic flaw that actually leads the protagonist through their story. Because they have this flaw, they have made a certain decision that leads them into a particular story. That's a tragic flaw. Other flaws in comedies or in romance films or in horror films are not necessarily going to be the cause of the character in the rest of the story, but simply be something that follows that character. This is where you have a well-developed characters. A lot of poor filmmakers, they concentrate on the strengths of their protagonist, they don't concentrate on the flaws of their protagonist, and they end up with a weak, poorly developed character. They'll do the reverse with the antagonist. They'll concentrate on the flaws of the antagonist, they won't develop any strengths of the antagonist, and that's what we call a flat antagonist. We have flat characters when we don't develop both of these things, their flaws and their strengths. So this is what you're doing with your protagonist. Again, to review, you're going to do the voice and the nature of your protagonist as you are with all your characters. You're also in Act 1 going to establish the objective or the desire of your protagonist. The flaws and the strengths of your protagonist are all going to be what you're doing in this first act. That is all going to come, again, through using concrete language. The last major establishment that you're doing in Act 1 is establishing the premise. The premise of the film, remember, is the meaning of the film. This is where we in class had divided up your favorite stories and your favorite films, and we wrote the story element of your favorite film, and then we also wrote the premise of your favorite film. So in Drew Ashton's example, one of his favorite films is Gummo, and the story of Gummo is the story of individual members of a sort of extended or localized created family, specifically in Ohio. As opposed to the premise of that film, which is that reality, as base and as crude as it may be, is worth something. It's worth at least looking at. It's worth knowing. And so that premise is not the story. So this is what you want to come up with. It instead is the meaning of the story. You want to start establishing the meaning of your story in your Act 1. So your premise is being established in Act 1. Just like coming up with your protagonist objective, this is something that's going to come about by simply letting your imagination run wild. Your premise is going to come out the same way. There are very few filmmakers who know their premise from the beginning of the film. And as I said before, it's actually more difficult. If you know your premise when you're starting your film, I want to make a film that has a premise about, we can take Gumbo, about the reality, the crude and harsh and base reality. Now you've got to backtrack to a certain extent. You've got to find your setting. What setting would best show base crudeness? You got to backtrack and find your characters. What characters would best show crudeness and base life? You got to go back and find your protagonist. What protagonist would show the reality, the gritty, grimy reality of this sad kind of existence? You got to go back and find a protagonist that does that. So it doesn't always lend toward the strongest storytelling to start out with your premise. Many times it's better to just let your imagination run wild, to find something you're interested in, a story that you're committed to, people that something about them, you want to capture them on camera. You want to show something about their life on camera. Then you ask yourself, why? Why am I interested in, if we go back to this particular setting, so why am I interested in on June 2nd, 1865? Why am I interested in characters who are slaves the day that the Civil War ends? Why am I interested in a protagonist who was in the middle of being hunted and chased because she was running away? She was running away on the Underground Railroad, and she's lost in this intermezzo space. She hasn't gotten the news that the Civil War has ended, and yet here she is, regardless of that Civil War ending, trying to find and fight for her own freedom. Why is that what's interesting to me? Why do I want to capture that? And then you may say that the premise of your film is if you wait to be told that you are free versus if you go and receive your freedom, which one of those is true freedom? And that's just coming out of imagining the story and first looking at what's attracted you to the story, and then you're getting premise. So once you start to ask yourself of your imagination, the same as we did, asked ourselves, well, if we like this protagonist, then what does she want? What is she after? Same thing you're going to do. What do I like about this setting? What do I like about these characters? Why am I about to spend this much time developing a story with them? Why am I driven to capture images of them? Once you do that, then you're going to start to see your premise. Another way that your premise is going to come through is simply by you being detailed in establishing your setting and your characters. So your premise can be the images you decide to create. So again, when we go back to that, even the opening image that I created just to establish my setting, where we have the cotton fields, then we have the Neo-Roman, Neo-Greco, plantation house, then we have the small cabin, the shack where the slave quarters are. When we just look at that image, what are the themes that are coming through in that image? A big house separated by this vast, plot of land, which is growing this product. And then this small house on the edge of that land. What's separating the people who live in that house and the people who live in this house? This field. What is this field about? This field is about commerce. This field is about money. So that's what separates these two people. One person that reaps the benefit of the money and one person that pulls the labor to extract that which will make the money. So now all of a sudden we might go, the premise of this film has to do with how economics can lock human beings into such disparate positions. And economics is what can even generate hate and separation. So that could be the premise that all of a sudden is simply coming out of your images. The best way to develop your premise or just begin introducing your premise in Act 1 is to create strong images. So without even setting and making a premise statement yet, simply make sure that you write with strong images, that your first image is a strong first image, something that rivets you, that interests you. Make sure that's what you're doing, and that's also what we mean by hook. Make sure that that first open is something that hooks in your audience, that attracts them, that draws them, that allows this film to be like a car accident that you pass on the freeway, where you just keep turning your head. You can't seem to look away. That's what you want to do, and it's going to be an image that does that.